start the evening, I'd like to ask our brand-new, is the founder of Link Koller, and he was back in Westwood many years ago and was our rabbi he's still our rabbi at this Kehillah and Westwood based Knesset. And without further ado, please bow rabbi.
Really don't. Beautiful community, beautiful group of people that are here. And Bershut, the Rosh Kollel of the Nevar, and the son of the Mola, that is the son of Rabban, the son, the special sport that we're here. And I just would like to share with you for 3 minutes how moving it is for me, who does not claim to be part of this community in a certain way, to see the concept of being Meirim Keren, to raise the pride of the beautiful Persian Torah community. And we acknowledge also the presence of Rabbi Zargari and the other Rabbanim here. I want to tell you, I learned a number of things about the Sefer just today. Number one, I learned that I'm going to share with you 7 or 8 quick things for you to think about. Number one, that the Persian Jewish community is the longest diaspora community in our history. If you go back to what Chacham Avishai Shuava says, you go back to the time of Shalman Neser, which is before the time of the Churban Bayit Rishon. We're talking about 2,600 years of continuous presence of Jews. That's incredible, number one. Number two, Ravina and Rav Ashi, anybody who learns Gemara, resided in Paras. Number three, Hamadan, which I learned is not Shushan, is still mentioned in the Gemara. The Gemara says explicitly Hamadan. Number four, Rashi in Baba Kama, Daf Gimel tells us that the second greatest language after Hebrew is not English. It's Farsi, even more than Aramaic. Rashi, Baba Kama, Daf Gimel. Number five, besides Mordechai and Esther being buried in Hamadan, which I'm sure you all know, Daniel is buried in Shush. And there's a shrine in Tuzarkan for Habakkuk, and so I mispronounced it. Tuzarkan, okay, I told you. Okay, I'm an outsider, I'm trying to be an insider. There's a shrine for Habakkuk, even if probably he was not buried there, but there are no shrines for Habakkuk in Los Angeles, as far as I know. The miracle, number 6 or 7, wherever I'm up to, the miracle of the Otzar HaTorah schools. Incredible what we and everybody in this community owes to Rabbi Yitzchak Meir Levi. And number 7, I had the opportunity to read some of the tshuvot of the Chacham of the Mola, and there's an incredible line, and I'm speaking now to everybody, but in particular the Torah scholars are the ones that appreciate the Torah literature. It's not simply about the content, but it's about the Yirat Shamayim and the Avat HaTorah that emerges from the actual tshuva responsa. So there's an amazing line. The Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo was, of course, the great source of the Shulchan Aruch, and the Chacham knew the Shulchan Aruch very well, especially when it came to the laws of inheritance and the laws of Ketubah. He would often say, Lechu El Yosef, V'chol asher yomar lachem ta'asu, which is a beautiful paraphrase on a pasuk. The strength and the power of the Persian Jewish community can be seen very clearly from the beautiful and strong writings of the Mola. And I just want to conclude with this, and here I speak personally. I have such nachat, such incredible, incredible pleasure to know that the student, one of the individuals who contributed to this Sefer so much, is, to my right, is Mr. Avishai Shraban. I don't know if he would call me a Rebbe, but I can call him a Rebbe, because I learned so much from him. I learned so much from him all the time, and it's such nachat. And such nachat from Sharam and the whole mishpacha. And we need to think for 1 minute, and I know Rabbi Lebron, my time is up, I'm finished right now. Just, you have to trust me. But I just want you to know that in the bracha of Shmoneh Esrei, we talk about the coming of the Mashiach. What immediately precedes that is the kibbutz galuyot, tikar v'shofar gadol l'chirutenu, and the saneis l'kabetz galuyotenu. And the ingathering of the exile, that's what's happening here. Then after that we say, Et tzemach davir v'chavir tatzmech, v'karno tarum b'shuatecha. And karno tarum b'shuatecha means the lifting up of the pride. Everybody in this room should be proud of the incredible loyalty and greatness of Torah that this Sefer represents. The loyalty to Torah values. When we have pride that we are on the precipice or we are on the verge of the Messianic era. Yehi Ratzon, may it be Hashem's will that this beautiful Sefer, which is full of beautiful Torah, should give us great pride, great simcha, and it should bring tremendous nachat to all those that brought this Torah into the world. And of course, Yedidi Ahudi Rabbi Lebron, thank you for creating Machon Magin Avot. Yishar Tov Achad.
Thank you, Rabbi Ryder. Our next speaker does not need any introduction. You all know him, and he's the pioneer of the Jewish community in Los Angeles. I'd like to ask Rabbi Zagari to please come up
It's a pleasure being here. Thank Rabban to bring about something that is really a source of pride for our community. Thank you very much. You see, when I came to town, so he said, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah. He said, Ki stands for Kashan and Yaz. That was the Chamididia. That he, I guess, more recently, the centers of Torah were Kashan, that's where he came from, and even though my parents are from Kerman, but Kerman is one of the hearts of Yazd. So, and also they have here other Yazd families. You see, Torah didn't exist in Iran without any doubts. This is something that is substantiated in different ways, etc. And you see, what is, and you see, Torah observance. Torah observance was kept to decades in all Persian cities. I grew up out of Iran. A lot of these things I learned here. I remember when I started my shul, somebody told me that, in Iran, in different cities, they had Asher Eruv. What is Asher Eruv? They would make everything shitty. They carried everybody knows. They carried it in the Mahaleh. Why? Because it was Eruv. And every year they would make Asher Eruv. Details of Halacha. My mother, she had a story that goes in every city in Iran, how the grandmothers would break the ice to go to mikveh. Torah observed. My mother tells me, I'm going to next week, again, there's 700 kids. If your husband is in Tehran and you're in Kerman and he holds one end of the string, you cannot hold the other end. They would not sit on the same mat. They kept the halakha to details. Shabbat, Kashrut, Taharat Mishpacha. These, all the details of halakha were kept. And this is totally substantiated. Everybody knows what the Chida wrote in the Shema Gedolim, that there he talks with they met that in Iran there was a big, strong emunah. People had a lot of emunah in Shema, but they're illiterate. That's what he said here. Dr. Tzaddik, Daniel Tzaddik from Great Neck, he wrote a book that was published by Rav Kook, that he proves that what really the Hida is talking about, it's not paras proper, it's where the Gemara was written, and it was written in Babel, right? Babel is Iraq. But you see, one thing is evident, that we did not have Torah literature. This is, very few books. I'm missing to be much more knowledgeable on this about the evidence. But to my, this is something that, and also, we did not have yeshivot of, to speak of. My mother told me that the Mullah of Kerman studied in Baghdad. Baghdad was the center, right? All the mullahs in the different cities, they would get trained in Baghdad. Baghdad was the center. See, I have my theory why, especially, years after the revolution, once I was invited to speak in Great Neck, New York, about Torah Mishamayim. Teachings of my Rebbe, Weinberg Zatzar, Esha, this is prepared a lecture, I went there, after I finished speaking, proving Torah Mishamayim, so somebody got up and said, what are you telling us? We don't have any problem with Torah Shabbat. That we believe. Our problem is Torah Shabbat. Right? Our problem is Torah Shabbat, not Torah Shabbat. And here in Los Angeles, we have a certain doctor that he wrote the whole thing defending 10 Commandments and Torah Shabbat for Shul Shabbat. The problem was in Torah Shabbat. And again, it didn't, when it came to halakha, all the halakha were there. But Persian Jews had problems with Torah Shabbat. And it's my theory, I don't know. You see, there you have Sunnis and you have Shiites. Sunnis and Shiites. And from what I learned, Sunni comes from Sunnat, and they believe in Quran Shabbat. Right? But the Sunnis. But the Shiites, they are like the Kara'im. They know. They just take the written Quran literally. That's Shiites versus Sunnis. And I think, I could be wrong, I think some of this influence, right, instead of looking at the whole thing, how, you have, we are definitely influenced by the communities that we live in. And again, I could be wrong. It's my humble understanding that maybe Persian Jews started having in problem with Torah Shabbat living in a Sunni community. Baghdad, Iraq, it's most of them at the time Shiite, the Sunnis were, and all in other Sephardic communities that they had Sunnis. I think there was more yeshivot, there was more Torah Shabbat. This was a lacking, I think, that did exist in Iran. Even though, again, when it came to halakha observance, it was to the point, much dikdukim, that we didn't know. Even after the revolution, there were Persian ladies. So, no, this is not kosher. They would go kosher, get kosher meat, and they would do nikur again. It's not good enough, right? Which is the dikdukim, again, they're not talking about before the revolution. It was spoken about 2,700 years of history. Out of these 2,700 years, at least 200, maybe 1,600 years, Persian Jews lived with halakha. There's no question. You cannot judge the Persian community before the Shah and through the revolution. That I have a whole lecture on it, how we get there. But the fact is, Torah observance was to the maximum, but there was a lack of studying and writing about Torah Shabbat. There have been stories that recent about Musar, etc., etc., But Baruch Hashem, right? I think this is, we are going to see this. This is end of an era and beginning of a new era. I think Khomeini did a big service to us because I don't think Luleh Khomeini would have the Torah communities that we have nowadays in the Persian communities all over. And it's a lot of it. It's the Zuchus. Rav Levi was mentioned before. It's the Zuchus of Newberg there. That it's a whole lecture by itself. But Baruch Hashem, now we are somewhere else. Now our community, I'm sure this is the first of many more Sfarim that will come now. We have so many Roshei Yeshivot, Roshei Kollelim, big time in Eretz Yisrael. And they are going to create Torah literature that past is going to be forgotten. Just in conclusion, it was mentioned that Habakkuk is buried in Iran to Yisrael Khan. And he said, Habakkuk was the one that said, Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh. And you see, what really kept us was that emunah. Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh, the Melech says, Kol mitzotecha emunah. And there's a famous story about Winston Churchill, that in 1922 or 1923, I think, he visited Palestine of those days. He went to visit the Arabs, the Jews. So he was also invited to come to Tel Aviv. Right? And Tel Aviv has been just established then. And the mayor realized there are no trees there. So he went to Petach Tikva, Ema Moshavot, and he imported a few hundred palm trees that were older palm trees. And I think they planted them around Sderot Kakal in Tel Aviv. Just they brought it and they put the trees, and a few days later, Winston Churchill came, the street were crowded, and you get a good glimpse of Winston Churchill climbing on these trees, and the trees started falling right and left. Nobody was injured. Winston Churchill had to speak. He says, Torah b'goyim atam, chokhmah b'goyim ta'amim. Winston Churchill said, did you see these palm trees falling? He said, yes. He said, I think God is giving you a message. You guys got up from wherever came to Israel. Don't forget your heritage. He said, your roots are, if you don't have roots, you're going to fall here like these trees. Baruch Hashem, Persian Jews had that emunah. They had the roots of emunah that kept them. Tzadik be'emunato yichyeh. And that's really why we are here now. Baruch Hashem, being the oldest community, right? One of the oldest, this is our first exile. And Baruch Hashem, who brought us to America, and a lot of us, you see, America and California, America is either Umareka or Imreika. So we came towards the Imreika. California also, this is Klipa and Ner. And Baruch Hashem, a lot of Persian Jews that came here, they stuck to the Ner, and that's the Klipot. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Tiger. Our next speaker is Rabbi Davidi. He is the head of Chacham of RCC, and he has helped quite a lot with the publication of the book, and I'd like to ask him to come up and speak a few words.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. It's I didn't have the privilege to know everything that was said before, but I think whoever is going to talk about this topic is going to more or less reiterate the same points. And that is what Rabbi Zagari emphasized, but I'm going to try to look at it from a different angle. The importance of this setter. It's not, and I can say I have paged through most of it, it's not so much the content. It's not so much does it have big, complex questions and pulling and back and forth and give and take. That's not the point. The point is as follows. When I was in Israel, there was a Gary many years ago, a yeshiva Bakur from a Persian Bakur who had gone to Israel in Parliament came to the yeshiva. And I'm not sure where he came for. He was in Parliament. And he said that he has taken Ashkenazi minhaj. He converted completely to Ashkenazi. Why? He said a very, very great Rav told him that, listen, you were not religious when you came here. You have no Masorah. These were his words. You have no Masorah. You have no tradition. Therefore, you're neutral, you're powerful. So now that we Ashkenazim are teaching you the Torah, so we're going to tell you have to follow the Ashkenazim Masorah. That stuck in my ears and my mind for the past 7 years, and I think it's really not right and it's really not accurate. It's one thing if a non-Jew converts to Judaism and you actually become an Ashkenazi Jew or a Sephardi Jew. So if you ask Rabbi Ovadia Zatzal, will tell you, well, if it's in Israel, you should become a Sephardi. Because Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch was the main Rav of Israel, so you should become a Sephardi. And I'm telling Israel, you should follow the Bedim, and that's what we do. That's not the case over here. If you're going to say any person who was not being grow up religious, or his father did not grow up religious, all of a sudden he has no tradition, he's starting from zero, but then everybody, half of the Jews in the world, not majority of Jews out there. It's very inaccurate to say that. The reality is that we had a Masorah. 100%, as I said, there was a Masorah, meaning tradition, and it was continued. Whatever shape or color it had, it was never disconnected. It so happened this morning, out of the blue, I got Rabbi Grami from Tehran asked me about something, and then he sent me a picture of a ketubah. The ketubah is from Isfahan. It's from 371 years ago. From 5,409. We are now 5,782. I have to use my calculator. So it is 372 years. And the text is almost exactly the text that we use today. It happened to be, it was a second marriage, so you can't really prove whether it was a writer or not a writer. But it's second marriage was marriage, it doesn't have that anymore. But the text is almost exactly the text that we use. No difference. And I wrote in the preface that I wrote to the Sefer that there were other the books that you know were written, meaning copied off of in Isfahan and other places in Iran. There was again alluded to Sifrei Musar. We know the book that Dr. Amnon Metzer put out. I don't know if I've mentioned before, perhaps it was. But the point is, to say that the Jews did not have a Masorah, it's an absolutely shtaka hadavar v'lo ya'amad. It's not to be mentioned. The importance of what we see from Rabban is that even though they were not famous, but that tells you that, let's say in Hamadan, let's say in Golpaigan, in all the cities, they had people who had a certain amount of knowledge, enough to carry over to the next generation. And it was enough to bring us to the gates of the great civilization that the Shah was ramming everyone through those gates. And Baruch Hashem, it didn't happen. And now, as Al-Zakari said, Hashem had a different plan. What really happened was that outside of Tehran, all the cities, as it was pointed out, had Rabbanim. My father Zatzal told me his father took his brother to Chacham to be certified by the father of Chacham Yedidia. That's how they had that friendship between my father and Chacham Yedidia. He took him to Hamadan, he took him to Yazd to be certified as a Chacham by whoever was in Yaz at that time. And he had a whole story about Yaz. Actually, Mullah Meir, my grandfather, that's how he went there. But again, see, it's a mixture. And on one hand, you have, as Rabban pointed out, very, very much strong adherence to halakha, but also they had this. There was no question the influence of superstitious items as well. So what was the test for an uneducated old lady that walked in very, very timidly? She wanted to know how great of a Chacham my grandfather Munawir was. So she came to him and said in the Yazdi, which I cannot relate, I cannot say, a Chacham came here and he put his hand on a lock and it unlocked. Can you do that? I said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. I had to make her repeat it because she said in Yazdi, that's a mullah, you know Nazuna? You know what to do. I don't know what to do. But that was it. On one hand, you had people who were Yodea Sefer, Yodea Taharafat, and on the other hand, you had the regular people. But it wasn't as bad as it was, for example, in the country of Georgia, Georgia. You read that the Rabban Hankins that spent several years in that country, was sent by Sasson Meltzer. He's talking about Darkei Mori, slaughtering animals in the forest to have a good crop. Slaughtering animals for the Shidadets, for Shedim, that kind of stuff. That's what they were dealing with. In Iran, it was not like that. That's the Khalifa, that's the Shalom. Never went that far. We always had Chacham, we always had Rabban. As a matter of fact, I regret that I didn't for it again. Many years ago, I saw a copy that some Rabbi in Tehran had written a little a dispute between two people in a financial manner on a little piece of paper, and he actually quotes the Quran. That's what is important to us. You have to quote sources. And this is the importance of this setting. If we had someone, and I'm sure he was not the only one, who was educated enough to quote sources in halakha, that already tells us that we have had a continuous tradition, and now it's a point that we have pivoted and we're going in a different direction. As far as what Rabbi never asked me, whether there was communication between different Rabbanim, the truth of the matter is you see that they always went directly to Israel. You see from this Sefer, he communicated with the Herzog and other Rabbanim. My father, of course, later, my father would have been half a generation after him because Rabban passed away in 71, I think. 74. At that time, my father was in Tehran, Hamiditi Allah was in Tehran, Sulik was in Tehran. But they, more or less, except for those three, which became the de facto Bedin in Tehran, who cooperated together, anybody else outside of that, and before that was Yosef Yazdi, Allah Shalom Shraga. Outside of that, in other cities, they went directly to Israel, like we do today. We have major questions where we turn to Mission, etc. That's where we go. So, to put it very briefly, the Jews of Iran never had an interruption in neither their belief nor the Torah education. Every town had a Mollai. You know what Mollai is? Mollai is Cheder. My father went to Cheder. Everybody else. In their town they had what's called Mollai. What did they learn? They learned An Yaakov, which is all the stories of the Talmud, from beginning to the end. And if you want to be a good speaker, you have to learn all of those stories. They learned Zohar. They learned Tanakh. That's how the Sephardim are more into studying Tanakh. They learned Chok Israel. They learned whatever Halacha they had. As I mentioned over there, my grandfather Mullah actually has a list with his own handwriting on his Sephardim. He has in there Sultan Aruch. He has in there Zipchei Tzedek. He has Derech HaChaim, Mevorah Shalem. There are many Sefarim that we are familiar with over here, Kava Yashar, which is a Sefer Musar. But, and I'm sure this was not the exception, but my grandfather, and my father, if I came home, was Musar was a small town. Compared to Firaz, compared to Chacham, compared to Hamadan, compared to Kurdistan, Kermanshah, let's not forget about that. They had Afanim over there. My father said, now I forget the name, he said, yeah, Basavade. Which means that's a lot to say about the Hafam, coming from my father. And this is the reality. We had, this is knowledgeable. And coming from my father, that's a lot. The bottom line is, Baruch Hashem, we actually really owe a big thank you to the family, and of course, Gadol Me'aseh, Yotim Me'aseh. The one who actually does it is greater than the facilitator. Let her and all those who helped him, and we hope and pray that we put out Rabban and all the other ones who really remain nameless, but their stature have come to light now through what he has done. That collective zechut will be very strong to push us all, Bezat Hashem, to be the Persian community that always was outstanding as far as their adherence to Torah and Mitzvot, and we will all see the truth, Bezat Hashem, in our days. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Davidi. Our next speaker is Rabbi Mordechai Lefar. Rabbi Lefar, we met back in 2005, 2005, when he came to Westwood, and Rabbi Brandon had the vision to bring him to Westwood to be the Rosh Kodesh, and also we had the zechut to have him be our rabbi, and we took a little vacation to this little country north of us in Canada, and came back for the weather, and obviously this book wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for his guidance and for his pushing and for him really recognizing the importance of this book. So without further ado, Rabbi Lefar.
Shalom Aleichem. Bruchim Habayim to everyone. For those of you who are wondering, what is this Ashkenazi rabbi doing over here on the stage? So sometimes I'm Ashkenazi, yes. Sometimes I'm Moroccan. Tonight I'm Persian. And my name Lebar is written, it's in Arabic with Ha. You know what that means in Arabic? It's the ocean. So, and sometimes it's Liber. And it's Lebarzadeh. It depends how you call it. Now let me tell you a little bit of a history about the book. Because you all came to give kavod to the Chacham. And once again we want to recognize his son over here, Mr. Tzion Rabban, Baruch Haba. Have a long life. And I want to mention how this came about in really miraculous ways. In 2005, as Shara mentioned, Rabbi Brander brought my family, my wife is here, my partner and everything, to Los Angeles. And I never met Persians before. I met a few Mashadis in my shiur, in my yeshiva that I used to give in Yerushalayim, but I didn't know about the Persian community. I grew up in a very prominent Moroccan community in Montreal, Canada. And by us, our traditions and our customs were of extreme importance. If you would tell us to change one thing, we would literally beat you up, literally. It's sometimes in the synagogue. There was no changing any custom whatsoever. And that's how I grew up, and it was in our blood. And I worked a lot on customs in general, on traditions and customs, and I recorded these things. I eventually published a book before I came to Los Angeles. So here I am, a young rabbi, never met the Persian community beforehand, and we had a Bet Knesset. It was called the Sephardic Bet Knesset, affiliated with Westwood Kehillah, and in Westwood, and I'm so happy. First of all, the nicest people in the world. Nobody's yelling at me, and they're just always gracious and generous and just so nice. I was waiting. Okay, when's the attack against the rabbi going to happen? It never came. So Baruch Hashem, I met such wonderful people there. But whenever I would ask some of the members, okay, so what's your custom over here? Oh, I don't know. What's your tradition? I don't know. And it frustrated me, because for me that was something very important. And I saw that the elders of the community knew some of the traditions and they practiced them. And I wanted to make sure that the yeshiva, Bachurei yeshiva that would come from time to time, like your son, Mr. Yitzchak, and if you remember, they would know their customs. They would know their minatim. And they didn't. And I would ask them, what is your customs? They said, oh, I don't know. And so what do you do? Oh, I just follow. I open up this book and I follow this book. And I said, what about your father? What did he do? And that can't be. It can't be that a child doesn't follow his parents' traditions in halacha. It can't be. It's a disconnect in our tradition. You are supposed to follow what your father did. Your father is supposed to follow what his father did, and his father is supposed to follow what his father did, all the way back to Hasinai. That is our Masorah as Jews. Every community, whether you're from Germany, or whether you're from Poland, or whether you're from Tunisia, or whether you're from Morocco, or whether you're Iraq, or Iran, or Syria, that is the part and parcel DNA of a Jew. And it frustrated me. How can it be? Are people not actually keeping their customs? So we started researching some of the customs, and we found out that there were solid customs and solid traditions. And meanwhile, Sharon comes to me and he says, Rabbi, I have a whole notebook of my grandfather's writings from the Beit Din in the city of Hamadan, and it's I would like you to look at it. And indeed, it was a whole manuscript with all the Piskei Batei Din, and I was very excited. I gave it over to one of my good friends, a very important Rav in Lakewood now. His name is Rav Ariel Ovadia, and he was a Rav in the Kollel at the time. He transcribed the whole thing, and it was sitting in my inbox. In the meantime, I went to Canada, came back, the whole story, and recently Rabbi Ovadia had a Torah journal in Lakewood, New Jersey, and he said, Rabbi Lever, could we put in some of these teshuvot? I said, sure. And a lot of the Persian Bnei Torah wanted to see more. And that's when we came up with the idea, and we said it would be an important thing to publish this book. Now, I'm a busy person, and Baruch Hashem, there's other publications that I also try to deal with. We have a publishing house called Magen Avot Publishing House, which deals with manuscripts from great Moroccan Chachamim that was never published. But we don't usually do other publications, but such a publication, a unique publication, the first of its kind that I know at least, of a Chacham, of his Piskei Dinim from Iran. Nowadays, as Rabbi Zahar already mentioned, look on the table, I see Rabbi Tzion Bashaul Korditzion from Persia, and there's a lot of Talmidei Chachamim, but they want all learned in Eretz Israel. It was important for me to know what about the Torah that was going on in Iran? Because some people had the chutzpah to tell me, like they told Rabbi Davidi, that there was Masorah, I don't know, and therefore I don't keep the Masorah. And that can't be. And that's Lashon Hara. And that's forbidden to say. And the main, and one of the most important, there's a lot of beautiful purposes to this book, but one of the most important purposes is to document and to show for generations to the whole Jewish community in the world about the system of the Batei Dinim that there were in Iran, in all of the different cities, whether it was Hamadan, or whether in Tehran, or in Shiraz, or in Isfahan, or in Yazd, or in all the other cities that there was a system of Rabbanim that learned. Yes, they learned in Iraq because of different reasons. There was a podcast that came out today, Jewish sound bites, Jewish history sound bites, that was dedicated in the honor of Mr. Rabban and by his grandchildren, and it talks about this presenter, his name is Yehuda Geber, talks about the history of Iran and the Rabbanim in Iran and why there was a dearth of yeshivot, but the continuous emunah and Torah and shmirat halacha and shmirat hamitzvot throughout the generation, Torah lo paskam b'Iran. And chas v'shalom for people to think that. And included in the Sefer, we had the Siyata Dishmaya, we had the tremendous Siyata Dishmaya, the tremendous help of Hashem, to have with us two wonderful budding Talmidei Chachamim from the community. And one of them, his father is over here, Mr. Esfian, his son, Rabbi Avram Ismafian from Yerushalayim, put together a wonderful compilation of the minhagim, of the customs of Paras, that people should know. What did my father do? They could open up this sefer and they could see. And they could see what's written inside. And they could see it documented. And that way, you never have to ask, well, I don't have a tradition. Here it is. Rabbi Elyashiv told me many times that if you don't know your tradition, you rely on the Shulchan Aruch. Whatever you don't know, and you can rely on Rav Ovadia Yosef Psakim and Rav Ben Zion Abashol Psakim or Mordechai Eliyahu, whoever is your Rav. But when you have a minhag, you have a custom, you follow your custom. And they did a beautiful job. Him and Rabbi Balhanes, his friend, and also other brother-in-laws also, I forgot. No, Rabbi Balhanes, Yosef Balhanes, together with him, two wonderful young Talmidei Chachamim from the community, and they put together this wonderful, wonderful work. And this is just the beginning. We have a Chacham over here who learns in the Kol Rabbi Shlomo Yisraeli, that is Be'ezrat Hashem also working on putting out Persian Hakim. And this is just the beginning. I met on Shabbat one of the Rabbanim of the community, and he told me, when are you going to print something, a manuscript from Shiraz? Now, I pretend to be an outsider. I'm not an outsider. Right, Persian? I'm not an outsider. I'm Persian. I told you. I 5 years I was with the Persians, I earned my title. And with the publishing of this book, I earned my title. I'm not an outsider. But I have to pretend to be sometimes an outsider. So I pretend not to know the politics between Shiraz and Hamadan. I understand everything, but I pretend not to. And I told him, you know what the answer I told this important Rav? I told him, when you give me a manuscript, I'll print it. And that's what I want from everybody over here. And that's what me and Rabbi Avishai Shraga are. I give you smicha now. You see that? The only one. That's what me and Avishai Shraga are working on trying to find manuscripts to publish like these and to document and to show. And you could learn. There was many minhagim that you could learn from this. You know, Rabbi Michael Ovadia worked on all of the annotations. So I just want to present you the book that is going to be sold outside. We're giving it at a discounted rate tonight, and the proceeds are just coming to help print more books. That's what it's coming for. And the more that the books, whatever, if you want to buy a bunch of books, Baruch haba. But please give them, don't let them sit in your cellar gathering dust. Give them to Talmidei Chachamim. The book is not all in English, and the reason is the following. There's a section of introduction and a few of the response in English. But most of it is in Hebrew, and it's not translated, and the reason why is because it's for halacha and minhagim of knowing intricacies in halacha, so you should know the Hebrew by then. And if not, you should learn Hebrew, which means you should come to the kollel and learn. And if you learn this kollel, the yachad kollel, or in Torah Chaim, and they're going to teach you, and then you'll be able to learn the book. That's a fringe benefit. So the purpose of this book is really that there's a section of the halacha. There's a section of seeing how the Beit Din functioned. There's a section of all the customs that there was in Iran, that in this podcast he speaks about actually the different Yibum questions and the different Tarat Mishpacha minhagim that there was. There's also a full section about the minhagim nowadays that Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yosef Balanes put together, a beautiful, beautiful section. And then there's historical sections about the city of Hamadan and its connection to Shushan Habira. And there's sections that Avishai Shogeg did such an unbelievable job, mamash, in putting together. He worked so hard on preparing this introduction in English, and it's also in Hebrew, about the history of the Rabbanim. And he's just so passionate about this, trying to track down some more Chachamim. It's really it's the big. Now, I know there was a revolution in Iran, but this is the beginning of a new revolution. Be'ezat Hashem. It's the beginning of a new revolution. A new revolution of unearthing the old and strengthening the ties that we had. So a child will always be able to say, I am from Paras, and I'm proud of our Masoret, and I do what my father does, and my father does what he did, and we are all connected to Hasidai that way. Not Chas v'Shalom to say, I don't know anything, and I'm gonna convert to somewhere else. Chas v'Shalom to hear that. Everyone should be very proud of the Chachamim that there were, and of the Minagim. And already, for example, on this podcast, on this Chacham, there's tens of thousands of people that heard it already about the Torah that there was. And there's people who are going to listen tonight to the presentation. And this is just the beginning. And Be'ezat Hashem, we're going to see with the slideshow that Avishai is going to present to us in a moment, where were these Chachamim? And afterwards, where Shaharam is going to speak and thank all the people involved in this project. And I just want to give a special mention to a Chacham who is not here now, is Rabbi Nitan Eli, who worked very hard on correcting the manuscript, spent hours and hours, and he wrote beautiful letters, and he deserves a lot of credit. He actually remembers the Chacham. His father was a colleague of Chacham David Sasson Rabban, so he wasn't able to be here tonight. But he was a tremendous help, and we owe him our publishing house owes him a tremendous help. Along with all the Rabbanim, Rabbi David worked very hard. Rabbi Sargari went through the whole sefer. Rabbi Shofet wrote a beautiful letter, and all the Rabbanim, the son of Rav Avani Yosef, who participated with the letter, and Rabbi Gidon ben Moshe, Rabbi Rosh Shraga, Rabbi Shmuel Pinchasi, and there was Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, the other Rabbanim as well. I hope I didn't forget all of those, the Gidolei Paras that there are in Eretz Yisrael. We're so proud to see this project coming out of Los Teheranes. Really. So you need that song. This is the beginning. Many, many beautiful projects from the Torah Paras. And it gives me a lot of nachat because that's what I'm about. Connecting to tradition. Whatever your tradition is, but connecting to that. So it gives me a lot of nachat and the chavod we're going to hear now from Rabbi Avishai.
Thank you, David. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you. I think Rabbi Lepo already mentioned. I think Rabbi Lepo already mentioned everyone that helped prepare this book. I remember the first time I heard about the book, I was at the old Leaf building on Robertson.
I didn't thank Shaharam and Ariel Zohar yet, but Shaharam's going to do that.
Yes. I was in the old Leaf building learning with I was there a few minutes ago in the book. And here Rabbi Lepo talking about something that was just printed from Rabbi Ovadia. He mentioned, and he said, that's impossible. I was told there is no such thing coming out of Iran. And I said, I want to be involved. And I don't know if he asked me, or I sort of forced myself upon him to write the introduction, but it's been a very informative 2 years. I learned not only about my heritage as a Persian Jew, about my own family a lot. I got to talk to my father about his father. My father comes from a line of at least 10 rabbis in a row. And it was very informative, very educational. I wrote the introduction. I'm going to present just real bits and pieces of it. It's going to be really short. You're welcome to read the whole thing, and you're welcome to ask me for the sources I used. If you want to see more, I'm certainly not qualified to write about the history of Iran, but I'm going to share with you what I found. This is a Gemara in Masechet Kiddushin. The same Gemara also appears in Masechet Yevamot. As Rabbi Zachariah mentioned earlier, and actually Rabbi Brandon, the Jewish community in Iran is the oldest Jewish community in the diaspora, and it still exists until today. I've heard different estimates today, anywhere between 10 and 25,000 Jews still live in Iran in relative safety and security. Today, in places like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, communities that have massive Jewish populations, I don't think you can make even a minyan. There are still Jews in Morocco and perhaps some in Yemen, but the rest of the Middle East is almost completely devoid of Jews in Muslim lands, except for Iran. And the history begins approximately 130 years before the destruction of the first temple. The Gemara says as follows, and it quotes a pasuk in Sefer Melachim. I'm sorry, I can't see it. The pasuk talks about the king of Assyria. The Navi refers to him as Shalmaneser. The Chachamim later tell us that it's Sancher Melech Ashur, who is the world leader at the time. Assyria is the dominant world power at that time. They exile the 10 northern tribes of Israel. At that time, the kingdom is divided between the south and the north, Judea in the south, and the 10 tribes in the north. And the 10 tribes are exiled to these areas. The Gemara later continues, tries to identify each one, and it says, Are Madai zu Hamadan v'chabotea, ve'amrila zu Nahavan v'chabotea. There's two opinions. What are Are Madai? Madai is Media. It was a separate kingdom to Persia. Today, it's part of Iran. Back then, Madai was Hamadan. You see Hamadan already mentioned in the time of the Gemara, and this is already 2,600 years ago, 130 years before the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. There are Jews living in that area. 130 years later, the dominant world power is now Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar, as the king of Babylonia, comes to Israel, the land of Israel, destroys the first Beit HaMikdash, exiles almost all of Israel's inhabitants to the east. And I'm going to show a map. I'm going to come back to the other map. This is a map of the Babylonian exile. You can see it goes, just keep in mind Susa, we're going to come back to that later. That's in modern day Western Iran. Up here is Hamadan, somewhere around here. But most of the Jews at that time are exiled towards the area of Iraq and Syria. Already up here is Media, where some of the 10 tribes are already living. Okay, I'm going to go back to the map before. I'm going to fast forward now towards the end of the 70 years between the first and the second Beit HaMikdash, as everyone is aware. Towards the end of that 70 years, Persia becomes the dominant world power. Ahasuerus, we're going to read about it in about 5 weeks, becomes the leader of the entire world. And his first wife, in fact, Vashti, our rabbis tell us, is Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter. He rules in a city called Shushan. Where is Shushan? Growing up, and probably many of you were told that Shushan is indeed Hamadan. You're going to see that we're not the only ones that were told that. There were great Chachamim that also thought Shushan was Hamadan. Shushan is almost certainly not Hamadan. Shushan is a city to the south of Hamadan, and more further west, which you see here, is called Shush. And there is a beautiful article in this book by Rabban, and he goes through all the sources, including Torah sources and non-Torah sources, archaeological digs they found. Really something amazing, and he proves almost without a shadow of a doubt that Hamadan is not Shushan. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later, why people thought that Hamadan was Shushan, but this was a misconception. During Ahasuerus' time, this famous story of Purim takes place, which is the most famous story in Persian Jewish history. And after the story of Purim, the Jews head back west, where they build the second Beit HaMikdash under the auspices of Ezra and Nehemiah and so forth. And that lasts for 420 years. I'm going a little bit quickly because I want to get more to the modern day Persian history. At the end, now it's something very important to remember. After the story of Purim, when the Jews went back to build the second temple, very, very, very few Jews went back. And this is described in our introduction in detail. I read one estimate that only 40,000 Jews went back. The majority of the Jews remained in this area called Bavel, Paras. Remember, the Babylonians and the Persians would play ping pong. There was a lot of wars going back and forth who ruled the world at that time. So this area became a Jewish community, a big Jewish community. From then, from the story of Purim until today, we brought sources in our book of communities that trace their lineage back 2,500 years until that very day, till from the Galut Babel. Sorry, I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward again to the end of the Second Temple era. This time the Romans destroyed the second Beit HaMikdash, and Jews this time are scattered around the world. Some now this time go westwards towards Europe. The Romans send them all over the world. A Jewish community remains in the land of Israel. The land of Israel remains at that time the main Torah center of the world, from the time of Hillel and Shammai all the way through Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi, who writes the Mishnah about 150 years after the second Beit HaMikdash is destroyed. But soon after that, it becomes too difficult to live under Roman rule, and Jews move again. The Torah center of the Jewish world moves back east, Bavel, Paras, where there was already an existing Jewish community. And I'm going to share a quote here from the Chidah, because this quote, Rabbi Zagari mentioned it earlier, and it's given a lot of attention in our book. We discussed it at length. But where the Jews go back, and it's particularly, specifically, Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi sends a student, Rav, which you hear many times in the Gemara referred to Rav and Shmuel together. Rav comes from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, and he continues the Masorah in Babel together with Shmuel, and they become the new leaders of the Jewish community and the first Amoraim. The Amoraim were those who wrote the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Bavli is known as the Gemara. Rashi refers to it as Ikar HaTorah. It is the main part of the Torah. Rashi says in the Masechet Brachot, the Talmud Bavli is studied in this room no less than, is it 18 to 19 hours a day, Rabbi Brandon? Every day. 18 to 19 hours a day, there are people studying the Talmud Bavli in this room. It is the main part of our Torah, and it was written in Paras. I'm going to read you the Chidah's quote. בואו ראה מפלאות תמים דעים אשר היו לו בערי פרס כמה דורות אמוראים ועד אחרם רבינה ורבשר שסידרו התלמוד ועמוד האש מן השמיים בישיבה וחלת האדר וחלת האלול ואחרי זה רבן סבראה ואחר כך כמה דורות גאונים והייתה התורה שם בערי פרס. The Chidah in Shem HaGeonim, by the way, the Chidah was one of the greatest Achronim of the Sfaradim. He passed away about 230 years ago. He was of Moroccan descent, but was a Yerushalmi. He was born in Yerushalayim, passed away in Italy of all places. And he says without a shadow of a doubt that Talmud Bavli was written in Paras. He says it was written in Iran. And the two people he mentions, Ravina and Rav Ashi, are the final Amoraim. We mentioned the first one, Rav and Shmuel. Ravina and Rav Ashi were the final two, and they also lived in Paras. And they were the redactors of the Talmud. That was about 300 years later. Now he brings this quote, it seems in a flattering way, but he brings it as an introduction to almost a bit of a put-down, where Rabbi Zagari mentioned, where he goes on and he says that it's a surprise to him why Persian Jews in his time, 250 years ago, were. He says they only knew the first pasuk of Shema Yisrael, nothing else. He says they knew Asher Shuletecha, the first pasuk of Shema Yisrael, and nothing else. Now, Professor Daniel Tzaddik, who was mentioned earlier, who wrote a beautiful book a few years ago, discusses this at length. And he gives a lot of answers. Rabbi Zagari mentioned one of them, that perhaps the Chidah was talking about another place. He also brings amazing proofs that there were plenty of Persian rabbis that had books of the Chidah himself, with notes, and they studied the Chidah in their houses. And we know that they knew Shema Yisrael. We knew that they knew a lot more than Shema Yisrael. I'm not going to really discuss why he said what he said, except to say the following, and it's been mentioned before. Certainly, the level of the Torah scholarship in Iran was less than its neighbors. We know that for sure. But not necessarily the level of observance. They still observed halakha to the T, but there were no books. We don't know of any books. We're doing our best to change that tonight. Hopefully the next one will be the Chachamim of Yaz. I promise you, right? Okay, thank you.
You'll find that we do it.
So why that happened? There are many answers were presented in the book. I'm going to give you my theories, but to do that, I'm going to profile 4 of the Chachamim that we wrote about in this book. We wrote about 10 or 12, and I hope one day to write about many more. But I did more detailed research on 4 of them. I'm going to present them to you here and tell you a little bit about each of them. Before I do that, we mentioned how the Gemara was written in Iran. It's interesting to note that it wasn't just the Jews in Paras that knew Halacha and knew Gemara. King Shapur I, who lived in the early 3rd century, is mentioned at the end of Baba Metzia as someone who was a Chavruta of Shmuel, who we mentioned earlier. Shmuel, who was partners with Rabban. King Shapur is mentioned by Rashi in Parashat Vayeshev on the pasuk Ben Porat. He said, Ben Porat Ale'ain. The person who mentioned the word Porat first was King Shapur. And Rashi says that's what we use. And if you want to see, I suggest you look it up and you see exactly what word that is. That's a word that's used today in Farsi, still today. It's a Farsi word. There's Farsi words all over the Gemara, and you can look for them yourself. Okay, I'm going to profile the rabbis that I told you, and I picked 4 Chachamim, not randomly. They were not picked in terms of how big of a rabbi they were, how many books they wrote, or the level of the Torah scholarship, really because I felt their life stories was really diverse, and I wanted to be able to present to you exactly what Persian rabbis went through. The first one is Rabbi Shmuel HaKohen, Hashem Yikom Damo. He was born in Yaz in 1851. His father was Ab Beit Din in Yaz, was known as Mullah Homayun. He left Yaz at a relatively young age after his father passed away. He went to Iraq to learn with the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim. And at the age of 20 approximately, he made Aliyah. He went to Tzfat. At Tzfat, he was recognized as a great Rav, and he immediately became the chief, not the chief rabbi of Beit Din, until when he was about 50 years old, he moved to Turkey, to a city outside Turkey where he became the Chacham Bashi in Turkey, in that city outside of Izmir. He was there for 14 years. His house then burned down. He lost all his books, all his manuscripts, and he saw it as a sign from heaven that he should have never left the land of Israel. He moved back to Tzfat, where he again became the chief Sephardic rabbi of Tzfat. At that time, Tzfat had very few Jews, about 1,000 Jews. It should be noted that the big rabbi in Izmir, who was known as Reb Chaim Falachi, also suffered from many of his books being burned. It's famous that many of his books never made it out. Reb Chaim Falachi was one of the greatest Sephardic rabbis in the past 500 years. Most of his books were burned, most of his manuscripts. But after his books were burned, he came back to Tzfat, where he served as chief rabbi till he became very old. In 1929, many of you know there was a riot, a massive riot in Eretz Israel. It's known as Me'orot Tafat. And those riots took place in the summer of 1929. If you've ever been to Hebron, you see outside the shuk, there's a big sign, the Arab shuk, that says, this, I don't know the exact words, this shuk stands on Jewish land that was stolen in 1929, something like that. 1929, there were massive riots all over through Eretz Israel. The Shabbat Goy that was employed in Tzfat by the local Jewish community tricked Rabbi Shmuel to open the door. Behind him was a mob of Arabs. They came in, they stabbed him, they killed him and his wife. The next one is Chacham Chaim Morer. Chacham Chaim Morer was born in Tehran. He lost his vision completely at the age of 2 in a smallpox epidemic. However, he then went to Yaz, where he learned in yeshiva. And there he learned the entire Torah, Tehillim, Zohar, and the entire year's Tefillot by heart. That includes all the Machzorim. He taught at the Alliance School. And he also wrote 3 books. One of his books is actually quoted in one of the Teshuvot by Chacham David Sasson. He's asked a question about when to do Birkat HaChama. Birkat HaChama is the bracha that's made on the sun every 27 years and change, and 28, sorry. And in order to answer his question, he refers to a book by Chacham Chaim Moreh. So it seems like they also, had access to each other's books. I'm just going to read. I found this when I was preparing today. And I found a quote about him by a famous geographer from Yerushalayim named Abraham Yaakov Brauer. Visited Tehran in 1935. He says the following: the Hebrew studies, i.e. religious lessons, are on a slightly higher level here in Tehran than Kermanshah, Hamadan, and Isfahan, thanks to an excellent teacher by the name of Mullah Chaim. Though he was blind from birth, this old man is the most outstanding Torah scholar of all of Iran's 60,000 Jews. His translations of the prayers and religious poems have been printed and are recited in the synagogues of Iran. Rabbi Chaim spoke to me in fluent Hebrew and encountered difficulties only when I made the mistake of using newly created words such as irgun, organization. This blind man teaches very bright children who can look proudly on his work relative to the small number of hours devoted to his subjects in the curriculum. Rachamim Melamed Kohen was born in Shiraz in 1865. He, at the age of 11, was already giving shiurim in public in the city of Shiraz. It earned him the nickname Molakuchik. Molakuchik means the little rabbi. This nickname stuck with him throughout his entire life. Even at a very old age, whoever went to talk to him would refer to him as Molakuchik. And he lived in Shiraz. He got married in Shiraz, and him and his wife, unfortunately, would have children who would not survive past infancy. They had two daughters, immediately passed away at very young ages. When they had a third daughter, they decided that they needed to get her married right away to get her better luck. They married her off at the age of 6, and she survived. They then had a boy who died, then they had another girl who died, and he was very depressed. And he had a dream that he needed to go to Iraq, to go to the gravesite of Ezra HaSofer, that was in Iraq. He goes to Iraq, to the gravesite of Ezra HaSofer, and while he's there, he visits the Ben Ish Chai as well. While he's at the gravesite of Ezra HaSofer, he gets a telegram that his son had a boy, his wife had a boy. He goes immediately to the Ben Ish Chai, being concerned that his son, might not survive. And the Ben Ish Chai gives him different advice. He doesn't tell us what it is. He writes about it in his book. And he goes back, he names his son Ezra. His son grows up to be a very big rabbi in Israel. He also became a professor in Israel, Rabbi Ezra Lamed, and he even won the Israel Prize for rabbinic literature. He passed away in 1994. He won the prize in 1987. His father, Rabbi Chaim Lamed HaKohen, at the age of 40, decides, I can't live here anymore, I want to move to Israel. His community, by force, prevents him from doing so. They don't want him to leave. He flees by himself, leaving his family behind. His family joins him 1 year later. He sets up a knesset, a yeshiva in the neighborhood of Nachlaot. You've heard of Nachlaot, probably if you've heard of Rav Aryeh Levin, who lived in Nachlaot. And he lives to a ripe old age, and he was the one Chacham that I found that published many, many books. Most of his books were left back in Iran. He had to republish them from memory. He wrote them again when he came to Israel, and his books are available today. There's his descendants give shiurim from his books. There's even a WhatsApp group, and I know everyone here definitely needs more WhatsApp groups. But that's him. He was extremely well versed in halakha and all kinds of midrashim. The last one I'm going to talk about is Mullah Menachem HaLevi. Mullah Menachem HaLevi was very interesting. Why? Because he was a colleague of Mullah David Sasson Rabban. He was only 5 years younger. He was born in Hamadan as well. And he also came from a long line of rabbis. And he was more of a worldly, I would say, Jew, rabbi. He visited France as a young man, where he studied there. He later taught at the Aliyah school as well. He spent most of his rabbinic life fighting missionaries. That's in fact something we found when we were profiling and we wrote about almost all the Chachamim in our book. They spent an inordinate amount of time fighting back against missionary movements in Iran. There were the missionaries that came with the sword, which were usually Islamic, and then there were the missionaries that came with perhaps a new set of clothes and a cup of tea, which were Baha'i. And he spent most of his time fighting back against Baha'i missionaries. He would have public debates against Jews that had converted to Baha'i, and this was what he spent his time doing. Now, I'm running over, so I'm going to try to speed it up. He also leaves the Eretz Israel at a young age. There's letters here in the book between him and David Sasson Rabban, and he writes a book. He writes a few books actually. He translates Rabbi Nubachi's Chovat HaLevavot to Farsi. It has not been published. It's only in manuscript format so far as I know. I haven't been able to find it. But he publishes another book, Matzevet Mordechai ve'Esther, Asher Ir Shushan Habira. Twice he refers to it as Shushan. He writes a book about he writes sort of a map of the kever of Mordechai and Esther and about the minhagim. He writes that there was a minhag on Erev Purim for the women to go to Matzevet Mordechai and Esther, the burial place of Mordechai and Esther, to cry until they fell asleep because they had a Masorah that their nevuah, that their sleep that night was 50% of nevuah instead of 1/60th of nevuah. And they all go to sleep there on the night of Purim until they wake up early in the morning and hear the Megillah. I'm going to end with this. He ends the book with a story. He ends the book with a story about something that happened when he was young, and a new Shiite imam was appointed over the Hamadan area. And he was not friendly to the Jews, and he decided to blame everything on the Jews, and he decided it's going to make the Jews' lives miserable. And he chased them throughout the town, and he forced conversions and whatever, and he saw that it wasn't working, and he decided the best way that he could get as many of the Jews to convert as possible, this imam, was to get their leader to convert. So he calls the Rav of the city of Hamadan. This story takes place around the year 1895. He gets the Rav of the city of Hamadan, and he gets a Beit to come up to him, and he says, cut off your peot, your beards, and convert or else. Basically, he tells them what he's going to do to them. And very respectfully, they say, we'd rather die than do that. And he says, okay, you have till tomorrow to reconsider or else. And he says, I'll see you guys at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And he writes about this at length. He writes about this story at length. He was a child when it happened. And he says that the Muslims were already waiting for 10 o'clock to strike. They had their bats and whatever else they needed. They were going around the Jewish quarter. He says that Jewish women that night had miscarriages out of fear of what was going to happen the next day. And he says at 10 o'clock stroke, the clock hit 10 o'clock, the imam came out and said, leave the Jews alone. No one's going to touch them. Instead, we're going to put a red band on their chest from now on, so they know who they are and we'll put them in their place. And no one could understand what happened. And they later asked him what happened. He said right before 10 o'clock, an elderly man came in to talk to the imam with a long white beard. His face was shining, and he asked for mercy upon the Jews, and he identified himself as Mordechai Tzaddik. And he came in, and the imam said, okay, and he had mercy on the Jews. Unfortunately, there's more stories about that imam here in this book, about what he did to them a few years later, but at that time he had mercy on them. Mullah Menachem Halevi, on the right, identifies that Rav that refused to cut his peot and refused to convert as Mullah Yehuda Rabban, who is here on the right in this picture, and he's in the middle in that picture. He is the father of Mullah David Sasson Rabban, who is here, the young man in this picture, and he's to the left in that picture. He was the Rav of Hanadan at that time. And he refused, and these are just a small sampling of the tzaddikim, of the chachamim we had. May their memory be a zechut not just for this community, for all of Klal Yisrael. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Adi, for the history. I know we are running a bit late, but
That's our custom. That's the Persian custom.
that is the Persian custom. We have to keep the customs as Rabbi Edward said it's very important that we do keep our customs. First of all, there's much gratitude to Hashem that for all the help and guidance that He's brought us to tonight. I want to thank everybody for attending this event. It means a lot that you have taken the time to be here tonight. And this is truly a historic event. I know many of the speakers spoke about really the importance of the book. Perhaps we didn't talk a lot about the book itself, but really what it matters. This is the first book of its kind to be published on Rabbanim of Iran. One that we hope will be followed by many more books like it. We are hoping that many other families will come forward with manuscripts from Rabbanim of Iran to be published. These works stand as a testimony to the depth of knowledge and observance occurring in Iran. We hope that these works help bring the current and future generation of Jews from Iran closer to Torah and the Jewish roots and bring much pride in our heritage. A few words of thanks and gratitude are due. There were many people who were one way or another involved with the publication of this book. I would like to just mention a few here, and on behalf of myself and my extended family, many are here, thank first of all Rabbi Mordechai Lepar for really spearheading this project and with his persistent encouragement and seeing to it that this book was published. He was the first to recognize and emphasize the importance of his writing. I know Rabbi Rabban mentioned also Rabbi Yehuda Ariel Galatia, who actually transcribed the handwritten notebook that my grandfather had left to electronic format. Rabbi Michael Oladia for explanations and footnotes and explaining the writings. Rabbi Netaneli for his extensive editing of the manuscript for accuracy. Obviously, Avi Shraga spent a tremendous amount of time researching and writing the introduction, which really brings to light the importance of this book. Rabbi Zagari and Rabbi Davidia, obviously, for their guidance, and Rabbi Mordechai Zanikian, Rabbi Abraham Sasson, and Rabbi Yosef Hanes, who wrote several sections on customs of Iran, including where the custom of Dayen comes from.
Shiraz.
Yes. And last but not least, Ariel Zaknika, putting a lot of effort as well. Many thanks to my siblings, cousins, and friends who sponsored the publication of this book and for sponsoring tonight's evening. Right after my talk, we'll be selling the book next door, and also there's refreshments and dessert will be served. Please, everybody help yourself and make brachot for the neshama of everybody who's passed away. I know we talked about a lot of Rabbanim, but to say a few words about Chacham David Sasson Rabban himself. Chacham David Sasson Rabban was born in 1879 in Hamadan to Chacham Yehuda, who was also known as Mola Yuda, which Avi mentioned, and he was the Rav Rashi of Hamadan at the time when that event happened, and I think the other rabbi was Mola Menachem, which was the father-in-law of Chacham David. So he was born to Chacham Yehuda and Mina Rabban. He comes from a long line of Chachamim who had come from Iraq to Yazd, and from Yazd moved to Hamadan. Going back several generations, we know that his grandfather was Chacham Eliezer, and also his great-grandfather, Chacham Eliezer's father, was Chacham Shlomo, and he must have been a prominent person because actually Rabbi Chacham Yehuda signs his documents saying that he is the grandson of Chacham Shlomo. And you see in the book there is a document that shows that's a certificate of Shechita that Chacham David had received, and it was signed by his father and other rabbis. He received his early Torah education in Hamadan and had gone to yeshiva in Baghdad, Iran for advanced learning. We know that in his 20s he traveled to Israel and visited Hebron and Ma'aref HaMachpelah and was allowed to go up 5 steps to the old entrance of the building. We have a custom whenever we go there, we go up the 5th step there where my grandfather stood at the time. And that is when he got his title of Haji. Many people knew him as Haji Mulad Sasson Rabban in Hamadan, which Haji means pilgrim. At the age of 30, he married Nushafain, daughter of Mullah Menachem Dayan, Tzedek, son of Mullah Rabbi, who is also mentioned in the introduction of the book. He was son of Mullah Aaron Dayan, which this was also another rabbinic family that lived in Hamadan, and they were Dayanim, as the last name indicates. He lived in Kermanshah at that point, and several of his children were born in Kermanshah. In 1930, after his father passed away, Chacham Yehuda passed away, he was invited by the community to come back to Hamadan and take his father's place. He became Rav Rashi, and he was of 18 of Hamadan with his brother-in-laws, Chacham Yaakov Dayan and Chacham Yitzchak Dayan. He handled all aspects of Jewish life in Hamadan for about 35 years. In 1946, when Harav Levi was sent by Rishon LeZion from Israel to Iran to look after the well-being of Jews of Iran, Harav Levi traveled to Hamadan in that year, and he actually he had the organization Otara Torah, which many of us all know it as Ganj Danish in Iran. He opened many schools in Iran, and one was in Hamadan, which actually Chacham David was hired by him, by Otara Torah, to run the school and teach Hebrew and Limdei Kodesh to the students of the school. Chacham David was a gentle soul who was loved and respected by all who came to know him. I have fond memories of Pesach nights when all his children would gather in his home for Seder. We would sit on the ground, on the floor, and when the time came to read the Maggid, I remember that all the grandchildren would all get together, go in the hallway, put my grandmother's chador on. Chador is I don't know what the English is. Veil, my grandmother's chador on, and we would pretend that we were coming from Israel, and they would ask us where we were coming from, and that's where the custom of Shalshalekan, we say in Hamadan, came from. I remember clearly it was a Friday afternoon, March 22nd, 1974. My two older brothers are actually out of town, and I was in the alley playing where our home was. I saw my mother stick her head out of the yard door, and with her hand signaled for me to go to her. When I got close to her, I saw that she was crying, and she told me that Baba Haji, which is how we refer to him, had just passed away. Since it was so close to Shabbat, I remember they couldn't move his body, and my father and his siblings stayed with his body through Shabbat. And the following Sunday, which was the 1st of Nisan, he was buried in Hamadan. Chacham David's children were Farangi Sfereguni, Zichron Ribacha, Habibullah Zamanzadeh, Zichron Ribacha, my father, Fergus Boheri, Zichron Livracha, Rahman Zarnikian, Zichron Livracha, and my uncle Sion Rabban, who lives in Los Angeles, and his presence is acknowledged. We're happy that he made it here. Also, Saeed Rabban Zichron Livracha, he passed away in 1920, and Iraj Erez Rabban, who lives in Israel, Rishon LeZion in Israel. People thank me for the publication of this book, but the credit really goes to my mother, Iran Ban Farajullah and Sobra Yadidi. My mother had great love and respect for David and always spoke highly of him. My father, who many people know him as Mr. Rabban. Mr. Rabban was the principal of Ganji Dimensional Observatory School in Tehran. And he managed through Observatory for all the books of David to be sent to Israel. He had a fairly large library of books, as it's indicated in his writings. He had access to many books, and from Gemara to Mishnayot and many other books that he actually refers to in his writings, and they were sent. However, my mother had the foresight to save some of the notebooks which were handwritten by Chacham David and by his father, Chacham Yehuda. She knew that these were treasures and works that had to be saved. When my parents moved to Los Angeles in 1985, with great difficulty, my mother managed to bring the notebooks to Los Angeles. And as Rabbi Levar indicated back in 2005 or 2006, I shared the notebook with him, and realizing that these were questions sent. These were basically questions sent from other Hakanim, from other cities, some from also Israel and other locations, had been sent to Chacham David, and he had written the answers, the questions they came from, and what the question was, what the issue was, and there were all halakhic questions ranging from marriage to business to get to divorce, all manners of halakha that get in question. Most of these were compiled between 1931 and 1961. I shared this notebook with Rabbi Levar, and he asked, as he said, Rabbi, are you allowed to transfer the writing? A majority of the writings are actually in Hebrew and written in Hebrew language, without a figure that many of my cousins mentioned why the book doesn't have a Hebrew. That was how they were written by Chacham David. But some of the questions actually are written in Farsi, but with Hebrew letters. So for those who can read them, they can actually read them in Farsi. And this project basically sat for a while, and in October 2019, when after my mother passed away, Rabbi Levar contacted me and told me that we really need to publish these writings. And Avi Shraga agreed to help with the research and wrote an introduction to the book. I did the fundraising from my siblings and cousins that I'm very grateful for them to have helped with publication of this book. And as we said, tonight is culmination of this project, which is earliest started 2.5 years ago, and as I said, we're hoping this to be the first of many other works from Rabban of Persia which will be published. Again, thank you very much for attending tonight's event. Hope that you learned more about the Rabbanim of Iran, and really the fact that books like these are really stand as a witness to the depth of knowledge and observance of Torah in Iran, as several Rabbanim spoke about that, and that's really one of the key things that we wanted to make sure it's goes home with everybody, and that is that we have a rich Jewish Iranian, Jewish Persian heritage, And we need to really connect that and make sure that our children and the many generations after us connect to that. That is very important. And Kollel is the place to do that. Thank you, Rabbi. Kollel, Link Kollel does a tremendous amount of work in learning Torah in all levels, from beginners to very advanced. There are many classes, there are schedules here. If you would like to learn more about the schedule of classes and things like that, we're hoping that we can arrange for a class where we can actually study the contents of the Chacham David's book. And please come and take some of the flyers for the classes and the schedule of classes, like I said, for classes for women, for men, for young ladies, young men, you name it, they have it. Again, yeah, we are here. Again, I would like to invite everyone to please join us for dessert and refreshments in the